They again bought the Longboat Key property for a bargain $125 or $1.25 an acre, as provided for under the Act of Congress of April 24th, 1820. The waterfront property is located on U.S. government lots 2, 3, and 4 in Section 22 of Township 36 south of the Tallahassee Meridian and Range 17 east of the Meridian. Mann's second son, the ill-fated 34-year-old James William Mann, moved to Longboat Key in 1893 to stake a claim on 143 acres of land to the south of his father's tract in the Sleepy Lagoon, Whitney Beach, Emerald Harbor, and the shore area. James Mann fulfilled his 5-year residency, gaining title to this, the second Longboat Key homestead, on December 28, 1898. James William Mann not only farmed and fished, but was considered a skilled carpenter, mechanic, and boat builder, and spent most of his time in living in Cortez or on Tidy Island. Yet the state census of 1885 simply listed his occupation as a sailor. Ironically, this same state census, a decade later, does not list a single member of the Mann family for its 1895 compilation. Could it be that the family was living on Longboat Key and the state census takers simply did not get out there? I think that's probably the truth. Besides his home on Longboat Key, James Mann also lived for a time in nearby Tidy Island before moving to Cortez, where he had a reputation for being a skilled boat builder. Earlier in the year 1898, the U.S. battleship Maine, supposedly on a goodwill mission to Cuba, exploded mysteriously and sank in Havana Harbor the night of February 15th. 284 American sailors and officers were killed. The shocking news is exacerbated by the raging newspaper circulation war between Joseph Pulitzer's New York World and William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal, gave rise to the battle cry, "Remember the Maine," and culminated on April 24th with the United States Congress declaring war on Spain. In between the sinking of the Maine and the declaration of war, Thomas Mann and his second wife, Lucianne Mann, sold their original 144-acre homestead on Longboat Key on April 2nd, 1898, to a wealthy Ocean Springs, Mississippi woman, May, or sometimes known as Mary E. Podevant, and her husband, June Podevant, reputedly a one-time Mississippi River boat captain. The sale price was $500, or $3.46 an acre. The Podevants had been speculating in Florida property since 1883, buying land in the parish area and a large tract at the mouth of the Manatee River on Sneed Island, where the large Indian mound was later named for them, today's Podevant Mound. In June 7, 1907, 2 years after Longboat Key's first homesteader, Thomas Mann, died, his second son, James W. Mann, and his wife, Elizabeth, sold their Longboat Key homestead to J.M. McMullen of Hillsborough County. McMullen paid them $800 for the 143.5 acres, Gulf to Bay, or $5.58 an acre. At the time, Jim Mann was dying of a mysterious infestation of worms which had sapped the strength of his once robust fisherman boat builder. Unable to work very much, Mann had little choice but to sell his Longboat Key property to support his wife and 5 children. Tragically, James Mann died the following year while his doctors stood by hopelessly, unable to combat the strange massive infestation of internal worms. By the time of the sale, The worm infection had spread to a man's brain, causing his death in the fall of 1908 of, quote, bulbar paralysis. Man's extraordinary worm-caused death was reportedly the first of its kind recorded in American medical history. In lay terms, the species that killed him was an embryonic form of flesh-eating tapeworm. It was called Sparganum prolifium gateus in honor of Dr. Hubert Hubbard Gates of Bradentown.
So I'm going to show the picture.
Yeah.
I just have to shift it around a little bit. That's okay. I've got it.
Okay. And
so this is not a real fancy Hollywood production here. I just have to kind of do the best I can with what we've got. But there's the picture of the article from the paper, and that's the doctor talking about the case, right?
Yeah, Dr. Gates. And I believe Dr. Wenzel bought his practice in 1937 when he came here from Wisconsin.
So that was not that uncommon that people got worms, but for somebody to die of it back in those days, that was pretty unusual.
There was a rumor that there was somebody else about this time that had contracted the same symptoms and had moved to California, but they had no record of whatever happened to the person, and
But now today, if you get worms, they send you to a specialist who deals in that, like a parasitologist.
Yes.
I had tapeworms one time. I had to go to a parasitologist, and he said it was from my sister Michael making sushi from salmon in Alaska. So he said there are two types of tapeworms. One's pork and one's fish.
Huh.
And so it had to be one or the other, and once they identified that, then it kind of ruled out the...
They named this particular species of tapeworm after Dr. Gates because he was the first one to report it in June of 1907. Dr. Gates discovered the rare malady in April of that year after being summoned to Mann's Cortez home to treat him for a severe case of dysentery. While conducting a routine examination of the patient, Dr. Gates was startled to find a mass of hanging tissue on Mann's left shoulder, chest, and abdomen and back. Asked what it was, Mann replied, "Worms." "Worms?" Dr. Gates exclaimed incredulously. Never having seen anything like this before, he performed an autopsy, or a biopsy rather, on one of the many nodules, and indeed found one thread-like worm or two encased in the lymph-filled viscule. Opening some more nodes, he discovered they contained from 1 to 3 worms. They were all of different shapes. Some were flat and made of segments like miniature tapeworms with budding process from the side, so I could not tell the head from the tail. Others were round in part and flat in other parts with thread-like connections between them. They had limited movements when first extracted from the sac by contracting and extending the budded ends. In papers delivered to the Florida Medical Association at Ocala in 1908 in Pensacola and in 1909, Dr. Gates described this unusual case and his findings. When I first examined him, I noticed the nodules under the skin, which had somewhat the appearance of acne, yet not showing points of congestion as in that disease. Newly formed pimples produced itching. Some were so close to the surface that by scratching it would rupture the cyst, and the worms would be squeezed out as formless white mass. I found this not to be a formless white mass, but living worms by placing them in a glass of water. They were free to move and assume different forms. By close examination, I found that they were not only under the epidermis, but in the connective tissue, glands, and muscles. And in some portions of the body, especially in the groin over the in the groins over the abdomen, on the left breast and back. They were in such great abundance as to make tumor formations, connecting the skin and deeper structures in one mass. Immediately after man's death, his body was packed in ice and taken to the rear of the Pillow drugstore in the old village of Manatee, East Braden, where Dr. Gates and Dr. Tolliver M. McDuffie performed an autopsy on the victim's body. They discovered that nearly half of man's left brain was a mass of worms. While undergoing observation in Tampa 4 months before his death in October of 1908, 49-year-old man experienced extreme fatigue and slight exertion, plus inhibiting paresis and gradual paralysis of his right side. I might add that in this talk that Dr. Gates gave to the Medical Association, he pointed out several factors that I didn't quote in here. And that was that he asked the patient when was the first time he noticed these things. And he said, when I was a young man, he said, we had just moved to here, and he said, we were out hunting in the woods, and I had this itchy thing, and I scratched the thing on my shoulder, and that's when I observed the worm coming out of there. And he said that it progressively got worse as it went on, and of course they have no way of treating anything. They never seen anything. Dr. Gates said that when he first reported it to Washington, they wrote him back. There had only been one other case like this, and that was involved a woman in Japan. And she had it on her thigh, one of her thighs, and the thing that they observed about both Mr. Mann and this woman, their basic diet was fish, and the assumption was that they ingested the eggs or whatever the thing, and it spread that way.
Well, we have just about 10 minutes or less left. So if we could, let's just sort of go over and make sure that you didn't bring any material today that we haven't covered. So I'm just going to take a break for a second.